Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're not just, skimming the surface. We're really plunging deep into the intricate layers of Africa's relationships with global powers.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
It really is. And it demands we look past the headlines, doesn't it? Really try to understand what's shaping the continent's path.
Absolutely. I mean, you see African nations, they're recognized as sovereign on the world stage. That's fundamental.
Right.
But the question we kind of have to grapple with is that sovereignty truly unfettered? Or are there subtler forms of influence creeping in, creating a new kind of dependency?
Exactly. And that's where our source comes in today. We're diving into this analysis called Recolonization of Africa, the players, the strategies, and the endgame.
Hmm.
It's a piece that, honestly, it really makes you reconsider the usual narratives.
It definitely pushes you to move beyond just the flags and anthems,
Mm-hmm.
those traditional markers of independence,
Yeah.
and instead to examine the deeper currents, economic, technological, even cultural, that are shaping how Africa interacts with the rest of the world.
And to really get what's happening now, you almost have to look back, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the Berlin Conference, 1884. That one event, it basically saw European powers just carve up an entire continent.
For their own gain. It set this long precedent, really. External forces dictating Africa's destiny.
Right. And that historical context is so crucial here.
It is, because what this analysis argues is that, okay, the direct colonial administration might be gone.
Yeah, the flags changed.
Exactly. But the underlying drive, powerful outsiders wanting resources, wanting influence in Africa that hasn't necessarily vanished. It's just
Yeah.
evolved. It looks different now.
Okay, so let's really dig into that term recolonization, because when you hear it, you might picture, I don't know, old maps, pith helmets,
Right, the historical imagery.
but this analysis is painting a totally different picture, isn't it? It's not about marching armies and planting flags anymore.
No, not in that classic sense. The analysis points to something much more sophisticated, multifaceted.
Oh, so-
Well, we're talking about the influence wielded by, say, huge multinational corporations,
Okay.
or the strategic deployment of military forces, but under different justifications,
Like counterterrorism.
for instance. And crucially, control over digital infrastructure.
Yeah.
That's becoming massive.
And these things are often framed positively.
Precisely. They use words like investment, infrastructure development, partnership, which, can sound great, but it might mask the deeper power dynamics at play.
Okay, so who are the key players in this evolving dynamic? The analysis lists quite a few, some old, some new. Let's maybe start with the ones with the longest history there, the former colonial powers.
Yeah, their legacy is still very present. Take France. Its monetary influence through the CFA franc. That's a big one.
Right, explain that a bit more.
Well, it links the currencies of 14 nations in West and Central Africa to the euro via the French treasury. Critics argue this gives France considerable leverage over their economic policies.
So it limits their financial autonomy.
Essentially, yes. It creates this sort of persistent economic link decades after political independence.
And France also keeps a significant military presence, right? We
Right.
hear about interventions in Mali, Chad, Niger,
We do. And while the stated reasons are often about regional security, fighting terrorism,
which is a real issue.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But the analysis suggests we also need to consider, well, are they protecting French economic interests, maintaining influence in their former sphere? These interventions are complex with long-term effects.
Okay. What about Britain? Their direct military footprint seems smaller now. Where does their influence lie, according to this analysis?
That's true. It's less overt militarily, but the analysis highlights the enduring impact of, say, trade relationships set up way back.
Okay.
Educational systems often still modeled on British ones, political networks that persist, and critically, British financial institutions, banks, insurance firms, they're still major players in Africa's extractive industries.
So channeling wealth and resources in ways that might echo the past.
That's the argument, yes.
Yeah.
The patterns can be quite persistent.
Right. Let's shift across the Atlantic now. The United States. Their approach in Africa recently seems very focused on military engagement and increasingly digital stuff.
That's a good observation. The U.S. operates heavily through AFRICOM, its Africa Command.
Mm-hmm.
They've set up this network, over 30 military bases and outposts across the continent. Officially, it's about counterterrorism, stability.
But the analysis maybe suggests there's more to it than just that.
Indeed. It kind of implies this military presence also projects American power American interests,
Mm.
especially, with other global players becoming more active.
Like China and Russia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And beyond the military side, the analysis points to the growing role of American tech companies,
How so?
acquiring data rights, building digital infrastructure, accessing intellectual capital. This whole digital realm is becoming a really key area for influence.
And then there's this idea of aid conditionality. That sounds quite subtle, but powerful.
It can be, yes. Humanitarian aid, development loans,
Hmm.
they often come with strings
Just
attached.
what kind of strings?
Demands for specific economic reforms like privatization, deregulation, or maybe requirements for military cooperation or political alignment.
So the donors get to shape policy.
It allows them significant leverage, yes.
Hmm.
It can influence the path a recipient country takes, often in ways that align with the donor's own strategic goals.
Okay, now for a huge player who wasn't part of that original European scramble, China, their involvement, especially Belt and Road, it's massive.
Oh, the scale is just undeniable. Over $155 billion poured into infrastructure, roads, railways, ports, stadiums.
That must have made a big difference in some places.
Absolutely. Addressing huge infrastructure gaps, no question.
But the analysis also raises red flags, particularly this term debt trap diplomacy. What's the concern there?
Well, the core worry is that some African nations, eager for development, might be taking on unsustainable levels of debt from China.
And if they can't pay?
The fear is China could then demand control over strategic assets like a port or railway or maybe political concessions as repayment. The Sri Lanka Hambantota port example is often brought up here.
As a sort of cautionary tale.
Exactly. Whether it's a deliberate strategy or just a consequence is debated, but the risk is there.
And China's role isn't just infrastructure, right? Their companies are involved elsewhere.
Oh, yes. Deeply involved in mining, telecommunications, think Huawei, ZTE, building networks, and also agriculture, buying land, investing in farms.
Are there criticisms around that too?
There are. The analysis mentions concerns raised about local labor practices in some projects, environmental standards sometimes being lower, and a lack of transparency in some deals.
Right. Now, Russia, they've been making a comeback in Africa too, it seems, but their approach looks quite different.
It does. Russia's renewed presence often involves military support, arms deals, political maneuvering, particularly in countries facing instability. Central African Republic, Mali, Sudan come up.
And what do they get in return?
In exchange for security help, counterterrorism aid, they often gain access to mining concessions, gold, diamonds, etc., plus diplomatic allies and influence with the ruling elites.
The analysis mentions the Wagner Group specifically. What's their role?
Well, Wagner, this private military company with, let's say, close ties to the Russian state, though its status is a bit murky now.
Right.
They've been active providing security for regimes, often in exchange for resource extraction rights, particularly gold. Their presence just adds another layer of complexity, really.
And finally, the analysis also mentions the Gulf states and other sort of emerging powers.
Yes, you're seeing more activity from the UAE, Turkey, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
They leverage religious ties, military cooperation, but also invest heavily in things like real estate, agriculture.
And others too.
And others too, yeah. India, Brazil, Israel, they're all looking for minerals, land, new markets. It's becoming a very crowded multipolar landscape.
Okay, so that maps out the main players. Let's shift now to the strategies. The analysis calls it neo-imperialism repackaged. What are the core tactics being used?
It breaks it down into several interconnected strategies. First, there's economic control through debt. We touched on this with China, but it's broader. Africa's total external debt is huge, over $1.1 trillion.
Yeah.
And the burden of just paying the interest can be crippling for development budgets.
And the big international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, they play a role here too.
They do. While they provide loans, these often come with conditions, structural adjustment programs, they're often called.
What do those involve?
Typically, things like austerity measures, cutting government spending, privatizing state companies, reducing social programs. The idea is economic reform, but critics say it can really hurt ordinary people and limit a country's policy choices.
And create a cycle of dependency, needing new loans to pay old ones.
Precisely. It can become a treadmill that's hard to get off, hindering real self-directed development.
Another key strategy highlighted is resource extraction and environmental colonialism. That sounds uncomfortably familiar.
It has strong echoes of the past, yes, but with a modern twist. Africa is still incredibly rich in resources, gold, platinum, but also now the critical minerals for green tech, like cobalt, lithium, rare earths.
Right, things everyone needs now.
Exactly. Yet the paradox is stark. Local communities living on top of this wealth often stay poor. They face pollution, displacement, minimal reinvestment.
And how do the corporations operate?
Well, the analysis points to practices where multinational corporations, sometimes enabled by weak laws or corruption, extract resources with little local benefit. It mentions things like bribery, dodging regulations, and sometimes even using security forces to suppress dissent around mining sites.
That leads to the next point, the increasing foreign military presence across Africa.
Yes, the sheer number of foreign bases and outposts, French, U.S., Chinese, Russian, particularly in places like the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, Central Africa, it's significant.
And the justification is often counterterrorism.
That's usually the public rationale, yes. Fighting extremist groups, promoting stability.
But the analysis suggests other motives.
It suggests these forces also serve to protect the economic interests of the home countries, securing mining routes, oil pipelines, that sort of thing, and also just projecting power in a world where everyone's competing for influence. It can sometimes even worsen local conflicts.
Okay, now for something maybe less obvious, digital colonization. What does that mean exactly?
This is about control over Africa's digital future, essentially. The infrastructure, undersea internet cables, mobile networks, data centers, who owns and operates them. Often it's foreign entities.
Like big tech companies or state-backed firms.
Both. Think Google or Facebook laying fiber optic cables, or Chinese firms providing surveillance tech. The point is, the digital architecture is increasingly designed and controlled from outside.
And the data itself.
That's key. Data is being called the new oil, right?
Hmm.
The analysis argues that this vast resource generated by Africans is already being extracted, stored, analyzed elsewhere. It's a powerful, maybe less visible form of control.
Finally, there's something called intellectual and cultural capture. This sounds more subtle.
It is. It's about how external ideas, values, even languages can come to dominate. Think about global education partnerships. Do they sometimes sideline African perspectives in favor of Western curricula?
Potentially.
Or the dominance of international media shaping narratives? The promotion of English or French over indigenous languages? Even think tanks and NGOs, often doing good work, but their funding sources can subtly align their agendas with external interests.
So it can kind of erode indigenous ways of thinking.
That's the concern raised, yes, that it can marginalize local knowledge systems and solutions.
Okay, so we have all these players using all these complex strategies. What does the analysis say is the ultimate end game? It's clearly not putting governors back in charge.
No, exactly. The analysis argues the goal isn't old-school territorial control or, slavery.
Yeah.
In fact, it's often presented very positively as development aid, promoting free markets, global cooperation.
But underneath that positive spin, what are the real objectives identified?
The analysis boils it down to a few core things. First, resource domination, but without the messy responsibility of actually governing.
Right. Get the resources, avoid the costs.
Basically.
Yeah.
Second, controlling that crucial digital data and infrastructure. Third, embedding military outposts for strategic positioning. Fourth, using debt to maintain economic leverage and act as gatekeepers. And ultimately, neutralizing real African political sovereignty.
So preventing nations from making truly independent choices in their own best interest.
That's the argument put forward. It paints a pretty concerning picture of the current state of play.
It does. So faced with this, what's the way forward? What does the analysis suggest for Africa to kind of break free and forge its own path?
It calls for a very conscious, strategic effort, a form of modern decolonization. This isn't about isolation, but about deliberately disentangling from these dependencies.
Yeah.
Things like pushing for technological self-reliance, fostering local innovation, cultivating a new political mindset rooted in, say, indigenous values, ecological awareness, real democratic accountability. The core idea is Africa defining its own future, not just fitting into someone else's plan.
Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive here, the analysis ends with a really strong statement. Recolonization is not coming, it is here. That's quite blunt.
It is. And it really highlights the urgency, doesn't it? Recognizing these subtle, often hidden dynamics that are shaping things right now. The analysis stresses that because it's often masked by positive language, it's even more important to see it clearly.
But it doesn't end entirely on a down note, does it? It mentions hope, too.
It does. It points to a new generation of Africans who are increasingly aware of these dynamics. They're challenging them, asking tough questions, demanding a different, more equitable future.
So the future isn't set in stone.
Exactly.
Yeah!
The analysis concludes by saying Africa's future isn't predetermined. It has to be actively shaped, actively reclaimed by Africans themselves. And that whole process starts with recognizing and naming this new type of influence for what it is.
So just to recap then, we've looked at the history, the modern players from old colonial powers to China, Russia, the US, their strategies involving debt, resources, military presence, digital control, even cultural influence. And we've considered the endgame argued by the analysis. It's incredibly complex.
Deep historical roots,
Yeah.
very modern manifestations, yes.
And maybe it leaves us and you listening with a final thought to cue on. In what ways might similar dynamics, maybe subtler ones, be playing out elsewhere in the world, in interactions you see?
Yeah, and what does real partnership, genuinely equitable development actually look like when you have these huge power imbalances? It's a critical question for everyone, not just Africa.
Yeah. Absolutely. A vital point. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope it encourages you to keep thinking critically about the forces shaping our world and, to question the easy narratives.